Life in Africa during the 1920s, resilience and transformation. Picture a world teeming with vibrant markets, the distant rhythm of drums echoing through the savannah, and ancient traditions interwoven with colonial upheaval. This isn't just history, it's the untold story of Africa in the 1920s, a time of resilience, transformation, and cultural brilliance. But what was daily life really like? Stick around because what you're about to discover will surprise you. The 1920s were a decade of global change, often called the Roaring Twenties in the West. But what did this era mean for Africa? Far from the flapper dresses and jazz clubs of Europe and America, Africa's story was one of adaptation, resistance, and profound cultural endurance. Today, we're taking a deep dive into life on the continent during this dynamic decade, revealing stories that don't often make it into history books. Get ready for a journey that spans bustling cities, remote villages, and everything in between. When we think about the 1920s, much of the narrative is dominated by Western perspectives. Africa, however, was undergoing seismic shifts that are often overlooked. Colonization was at its peak, with European powers controlling vast territories. This brought significant challenges: loss of autonomy, forced labor systems, and cultural suppression. Yet, amidst these struggles, African societies found ways to preserve their identity, innovate, and resist. But here's the real challenge. How do we piece together the true essence of life during this era when much of the history was documented through the lens of colonial powers? Today, we'll rely on oral histories, preserved artifacts, and the voices of those who lived through it to uncover the truth. Let's begin in the cities. By the 1920s, urban centers like Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Accra were hubs of activity. Colonial rule had introduced railways, ports, and industries, transforming these cities into melting pots of cultures. In Lagos, for example, you'd hear Yoruba, English, and Portuguese languages mingling in the markets. Street vendors sold everything from textiles to freshly caught fish. But beneath the bustling surface, tensions simmered. Colonial policies often segregated cities, with European quarters boasting modern infrastructure while African neighborhoods faced neglect. Despite these challenges, urban life gave rise to a new African elite. Educated in missionary schools, these individuals became clerks, teachers, and journalists. They began to question colonial authority, planting the seeds of future independence movements. In Accra, the press played a significant role, with newspapers like the Gold Coast Leader becoming platforms for political discourse. Away from the cities, life in rural Africa remained deeply rooted in tradition. Agriculture was the backbone of existence, with communities growing crops like maize, millet, and cassava. Farming wasn't just about sustenance. It was a way of life, intertwined with ceremonies and festivals. In the Ashanti region, for instance, harvest celebrations were grand affairs, marked by drumming, dancing, and storytelling. However, colonial rule disrupted these rhythms. Systems like the hut tax forced many men to leave their villages and work in mines or plantations to earn cash, leading to the breakdown of traditional family structures. Women often bore the brunt of maintaining agricultural duties and raising children, showcasing remarkable resilience. Despite the hardships, the 1920s were also a time of cultural dynamism. Music, art, and storytelling thrived, serving as both entertainment and resistance. In South Africa, Marabi music emerged from the townships, a precursor to modern jazz that blended African rhythms with Western instruments. Meanwhile, in East Africa, the tradition of Taarab music, an enchanting fusion of Swahili, Arabic, and Indian influences, was performed at weddings and communal gatherings. Artisans continued crafting works that told stories of their heritage. Intricately carved masks, beadwork, and textiles weren't just decorative, they were symbols of identity and spirituality. These cultural expressions defied colonial narratives, reminding communities of their roots. One cannot discuss Africa in the 1920s without highlighting the spirit of resistance. From armed uprisings to passive protests, Africans found ways to push back against colonial oppression. The Aba Women's War of 1929 in Nigeria is a prime example. When colonial authorities imposed unfair taxes, thousands of Igbo women organized protests, using song and dance to convey their grievances. Their courage forced the colonial government to reconsider its policies. In Kenya, the seeds of the Mau Mau movement were sown during this period. While it wouldn't fully emerge until decades later, the 1920s saw growing discontent among the Kikuyu people over land alienation and forced labor. Leaders like Harry Thuku began mobilizing the masses, laying the groundwork for future struggles. Amidst these tales of resilience, one story stands out. Imagine it's 1925, and you're in Dakar, Senegal. A young teacher named Lamine Senghor is addressing a crowd. He speaks passionately about equality, freedom, and the injustices of colonial rule. Senghor, who had served in the French army during World War I, witnessed firsthand the hypocrisy of fighting for liberty abroad while being denied it at home. His words electrify the crowd, planting the seeds of anti-colonial sentiment that would resonate for decades. This moment captures the essence of Africa in the 1920s, a continent grappling with external pressures, yet refusing to be defined by them. Senghor's speech is just one example of how individuals and communities kept the flame of hope alive. Life in Africa during the 1920s was a complex tapestry of challenges and triumphs. It was a time of profound change, where ancient traditions collided with modern influences. Urbanization brought opportunities and tensions. Rural areas showcased resilience, and cultural expressions flourished despite suppression. Above all, it was a decade that laid the groundwork for future struggles and victories. Understanding this era reminds us of the resilience and creativity that define the human spirit. The stories of Africa in the 1920s are not just tales of the past, they're lessons for the present and inspirations for the future. If you found this glimpse into 1920s Africa fascinating, there's so much more to explore. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more untold stories from history. Let's keep these voices alive.